Hi, I'm Nyla Boodoo. I host our Axios podcast, One Big Thing, and welcome to Axios' final event here in Dubai for COP28. We've had such insightful conversations over the last 3 days. Tonight is going to be no different from that as we wrap up and discuss the future of sustainable aviation. We're going to be covering a lot of things this evening, digging into not just the state of play in the industry, but what changes are needed to push sustainable aviation forward. But before we get into that, here's a quick view from the top with our sponsor.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. I'm Nick Johnson, the publisher of Axios. As Nyla mentioned, this is the end of our 3 days, our final event here at our awesome space, Axios House at COP, our first time in Dubai, our first time at COP. We couldn't do it at all without any of you being here, and we especially could not do it without the support of our partners. And I'm doubly grateful for Boeing for helping this happen. They have been a supporter of us since literally day one at Axios 7 years ago. So I'm very excited to welcome to the stage for a view from the top conversation Boeing's Chief Sustainability Officer, Chris Raymond. Chris, welcome back to Axios. Great to see you again. Thanks for being here. So let's start big picture with COP. Maybe like an internal challenge is that many thousands of people have come here, often from great distances, on a plane, hopefully a Boeing plane, probably from your point of view. But either way, that's a pretty big carbon footprint. So from your role as a Chief Sustainability Officer for Boeing, you're at the nexus of that. How do you balance that?
Yeah, I think you got to take it head on. Most of you that follow aviation know it's 2.5–3% of total worldwide global carbon emissions. So that's our challenge in the business. I sometimes speak and people will think, well, that number's low or that number's higher than they may have thought it was. Put it in a little bit of context, it's probably equivalent to the cloud server data farms. It's probably a quarter of what air conditioning is. The industry's always worked hard, though, on fuel efficiency. And I would just sort of put it to your mind this way, that if you got in your car by yourself in London and you were driving to New York, you could drive a perfectly straight road across the ocean. In your car, you'd probably spend 50 hours. You'd consume about 525 liters of fuel. And if you did that on a modern airplane, it's 7 hours and about 130 liters of fuel attributable to you. So the industry's really improved fuel efficiency. And I think the reason that COP is so dependent on aviation is how do we connect the world? We all got here. If I had a show of hands, most of you got here by flying. I won't put hands in the air if you carbon offset your own flight. But the fact is, and the pandemic showed, that human engagement is important to trust and collaboration and problem solving. And the world is connected through aviation. We changed that in 1958 with the 707, and we've never looked back as a country and a world, and only about 15% of us fly. So we've got to focus on the carbon problem, but we also have to collaborate in person to solve that problem.
So the necessity, I think, of getting 70,000 people on a Zoom call or on an email chain wouldn't really work. So accepting that people have to do this, okay, let's talk about the transition. What are the things that can go into making aviation part of that transition? Start talking to the pieces of it a little bit.
Yeah, we think of it as 5 pieces. The first one, I mentioned fuel efficiency, and the aviation industry and the airlines in particular deserve a lot of credit. Even during the pandemic, they worked on fleet renewal. And both Boeing and Airbus's newer airplanes were starting to enter service before the pandemic. That will generate fuel efficiency compared to the airplanes they replace. The second piece is operational efficiencies. These are very small things, but you might be surprised how hard an airline will work to save a percentage point of fuel or weight of water on the airplane. So these little things make a big difference because they use less fuel and therefore create less carbon emissions. The third piece is how we'll use renewable energy, and that's where a lot of people are focused on aviation, either sustainable fuels, electricity, or hydrogen. And the fourth piece is advanced technology, whether that's electric airplanes or future flight concepts or just materials like carbon fiber or electrical architectures on airplanes with batteries. So we've got to do all four of those things, but our industry also has a fifth piece, which is if it doesn't get all the way there by 2050, we've got an agreed to offsetting or removal framework through our international body called ICAO.
So when we talked last time, that was in March at our Axios What's Next Summit in Washington, D.C., you went through that list. And what struck me as someone, since you're in the business of selling airplanes, it's not just fleet renewal, it's those other four pieces. So tell us how you help people unpack that.
Yeah, we think they're all going to be required. We have to try all those things as aviation. And I have to credit the Air Transport Action Group. It's a Geneva-based trade association, and they created a document called Waypoint 2050. And they went through different scenarios of how those things might combine to drive down to net zero. But the question we really asked was, could we digitize that? Could we create a visual, digital representation of the global air traffic system? So we invested in something called the Cascade Climate Impact Model. We've got the model here. It's up in the corner. There's a couple
On the way to the food for after you eat.
On the way to the food by the bar, strategically located. But if you want to check it out, you can go check it out. And the thing the tool allows you to do is it maps that worldwide aviation system, and then it lets you replace older airplanes with newer airplanes or introduce more operational efficiency through something like better air traffic management. And then you can change the energy carrier. We put energy data in on the cleanliness of an electricity grid, or how is your hydrogen made, or how much sustainable aviation fuel do you have, and how good is it from a carbon improvement point of view. You can run all those scenarios in a real-time dynamic model, and you can see the impact on the global aviation system. And then we added a feature to project that out to 2050. So you can decide how much you think aviation's even going to grow between now and 2050. We have a point of view on that we've shared for 60 years called the Boeing Commercial Market Outlook. It says the world's probably going to need about 43,000 airplanes in the next 20 years, about half of which would go to replacing older, less fuel efficient, and half of which would go to growth. And that growth of the aviation emissions is what we have to mitigate and decouple from the growth in aviation globally.
And I think you can see pieces of that on the screens next to us. It's over in the back corner behind on your left when you're going to get something to eat after this. I played around with it a little bit earlier this afternoon, and what struck me is how the knobs on how it lets you think of it like holistically, instead of the way I think you might think of it as like, okay, we have a plane that now, if we bought it now, it would be more fuel efficient, but our current planes are 5 years old, so that's not a reasonable assumption. How do you talk about it with potential customers or people who are trying to understand the energy transition?
Yeah, we really created it. Initially, our thought was to use it to engage policymakers. If you were a global policymaker or regulator that was concerned about the carbon emissions associated with aviation, we wanted a tool to be able to engage in a conversation, show what would make the biggest difference, let you have some input into those scenarios, but then show what would make a big difference. And then if you get aligned around what would make a big difference, then we can write incentivizing policies to help scale up the industry we need. 10 days ago in Dubai, the airline industry on the governmental side and on the air transport side agreed that the thing that will make the biggest difference is sustainable aviation fuel, but we don't have very much of it. And they also agreed on a policy framework to start the process in different countries around the world to create the policies that will attract capital. And the intersection of aviation, energy, capital or finance, and policy is the great unlock. It's very difficult to find that policy in the center, but it's the great unlock. And I really want to thank Dr. Angela Wilkinson. She's the Secretary General and CEO of World Energy Council, will be up later, as will Lauren Riley and Nilly Gilbert. So we'll have all those sectors sort of represented over the next half hour. So.
We'll have Dr. Wilkinson up here shortly. I'll just say one thing to bring it all full circle. We talk about how much people enjoy traveling, how important it is. What was most interesting to me in that tool that you would see just as a framing is the line of expected traffic growing up, continuing, and then the map, as you mentioned, just how prevalent these kinds of trips are and the impact they have and why it's important to be able to figure out what kind of mitigation can take place.
Yeah, I agree. You know, I've been in the business for 38 years now. I've gotten to see this industry solve some really hard problems. And, you know, this industry put a person on the moon in 1969. So we can solve hard problems. This is a hard problem. It's attracting cash, it's attracting entrepreneurs, it's attracting startup companies. Engineering enrollments are up at colleges that we recruit from. All good things for this industry, and the world likes to travel. And we all know it because we're probably pretty frequent travelers in this crowd, but we all know how we felt in the pandemic, and we know how important that human connection is, and aviation enables that globally.
If you're familiar with Axios, you know you like we end on one fun thing here at COP. We're making that one Dubai thing. This is our first time here, my first time here. You are an old Dubai hand. Give us some tips for folks who are new, what to look at, what to do.
Well, I think one thing I'm always amazed at, because if I hadn't been an aeronautical engineer, I was going to try to be an architect. And just drive around this place, and the amazing architecture, the creativity of the buildings and the structures, and the pace at which this place has changed over the last 20 years. It's stunning. And then the other one I heard about but have not been, but highly recommended, is go visit the Global Village. Over 100 some countries are represented there. You can go and learn about cultures, the foods. Imagine that, one place you can visit sort of 100 countries and experience them in some way at the Global Village.
Tremendous tourist tips. Chris, thanks for being here, and a huge thanks for Boeing to making tonight happen.
Thank you, Nick. Great to be with you.
Great seeing you as always.
Welcoming back to the stage, me again, Naila Boodoo. So at Axios, we do one fun thing, and we also do smart brevity. So let's just get straight to our next guests. I'd like to ask you to welcome World Energy Council Secretary General and CEO, Dr. Angela Wilkinson. Thank you for being here. Thanks for coming out to Axios House.
Oh, it's not a shabby view.
Yes, it is a nice view. So let's just start by looking at, as we're talking about the aviation industry, we were just hearing a little bit about the fact is the aviation industry makes up about 2.5% of carbon emissions. So when we're thinking about sustainability, and particularly SAF, sustainable aviation fuel, can you just sort of first give us a sense of what that looks like? How much of this is fuel versus electric, like what that whole panoply is that we have here as we're thinking about sustainable aviation?
Okay. Well, if we look at the world energy system as a whole at the moment, 20% of the world energy system is electrified currently. And of that, a small but growing amount is renewable electrification. That means 80% of the world energy system is not electrified. And when we think about energy transition, this is what we've been talking about at Energy Day, we're looking at, by 2050, a bigger world energy system for everything, not just aviation, but all the other things we use energy for. And we expect that if we work really hard, half of that will be electrified. And if we work really, really, really hard, 100% of that half will be renewable energy powered. So there's still half that's not renewable electric generation, and it is other things. And that will include sustainable aviation fuels.
And what does that look like now? Or we're talking about, in general, we're talking about 50-50 blends when we're talking particularly about jet fuel?
Well, I think there's innovation on several fronts around how do we decarbonize aviation, or how do we get aviation to be net zero, right? So sustainable aviation fuels use waste or they have biofuel-based blends. There's hybrid fuels where you're mixing some sustainable aviation fuels with other things. There's electric flight. Let's not forget that. For smaller distance, lighter planes, that might be possible. But I've yet to think about a 747 with a lot of batteries on board lifting off.
Too heavy.
So innovation on several fronts, but also important to remember it's not just the fuels, it's the planes. The planes need to be designed different. It's not just the planes, it's the journeys. You can fly journeys to have fuel efficiency, much greater fuel efficiency. And it's not just the planes, the fuels, and the flight paths, it's people. Where do they want to go? Who gets to fly? And how much are they prepared to pay for it?
So from your perspective, where are we at? I wonder if you can give us sort of a grade on all of those things. How are we doing?
Oh, we're in our infancy, but we're hoping to go through our teenage years very quickly and mature into adulthood before 2050. Actually, get through the teenage years before 2030. So a very accelerated time frame and a challenge of a mind-boggling scale and scope and the modalities involved in this challenge. It's not just the technology, it's also the policy, it's also the financing, and it's also the regulation.
So we were talking backstage, as you pointed out to me, there's only so much fried chicken in the world people can eat. What other hindrances do you see to implementation here?
So one of the questions, each sector is trying to innovate. Aviation's really trying hard to innovate and also attract capital and grow its market share. But as we think about this transition, the reality is that it's going to be constrained. And that means we're not going to just have to think about how we grow supply. We're also going to have to manage demand. Who accesses the sustainable fuels? Who accesses the renewable electrification, and on what basis? So that is what we call allocative efficiency. It's very rarely talked about, but the reality is we're building an energy system that is going to be much more user-centric and much more demand-driven services and solutions. So we need to start thinking about how do we engage with new uses and users and shifting demand, and how does that relate to the concept of justice?
I imagine you would say that collaboration is essential to achieving all of this. Who would you like to see sitting at the table for these conversations?
Oh. So collaboration is essential, but it's not just collaboration between businesses and governments top down. It's collaboration bottom up and making horizontal movement. So, we have to involve more people and diverse communities, including place-based communities. We have to have cities at the table. We have to have different industries at the table. And we also have to have, dare I say it, we have to have women at the table in a different way. Not just women as executives, but women as pilots, workers, designers, owners, cooperators, and the same for the diversity of communities that's involved. We have to have the future at the table as well and on the menu. So not just the decision makers who are making decisions now to 2030, but who are the decision makers who are going to have to live with the decisions that we're making now? And what do they think about them?
I'm going to go back to what you said about having women at the table. Why? What differences have you noticed? Why do you think that's so important?
So I got very excited 30 years ago when they told me they were going to design cars for women. And then I found out that meant, where do they put the vanity mirror so I could put my lipstick on? That is not what we mean by engaging women in energy. Women not just aspiring to get through the glass ceiling. It's important to think about the uses of energy and what differences in energy uses and more energy means. So, my personal thing is, I think humanity, we're reaching for the stars. At the moment, we're astronauts poisoning our own air supply system. But which child doesn't dream of being able to fly? And half those children are women.
I wanted to just end by asking, the World Energy Council is such a big proponent of inclusive implementation. How do you think what we've seen so far at COP measure up when it comes to that?
So collaboration is a very big word, and the inclusive COP has been about not just talking amongst wealthy countries, but also including the needs of of developing and emerging economies, and also the voices of communities that are the most impacted and vulnerable to climate change impacts. They're at the forefront, they have the least capabilities. This is where the Loss and Damage Fund came from on day one. So inclusive collaboration is not just cross-sector, it's also aligned across different levels and segments of society, and it's also across borders. And this is the biggest challenge. The biggest challenge we face is if we really want to address climate change, we're going to have to learn more and more effective ways of collaborating at scale. There are many, many ways of doing that. Unfortunately, we've got into really bad habits, and we like to use the collaboration that used to work in the past or we're most familiar with. So the inclusive collaboration imperative is about asking ourselves, are there other and better ways of collaborating than the way we think we might be most comfortable with? And how do we engage with others who we don't necessarily know, we might not like, but actually we have to really work together and move forward?
The World Energy Council's Dr. Angela Wilkinson, thank you so much for being with us.
Pleasure.
Please welcome to the stage Axios Senior Climate Reporter, Andrew Friedman.
Hey everyone, thank you for coming. Thank you for supporting Axios House Dubai. It's our first ever extension of Axios' brand to a COP. So really excited to have you. So I'm Andrew Friedman, Senior Climate Reporter at Axios, and I co-write the Generate newsletter, which is daily and free, and please subscribe if you do not already. We have a great guest up next who has her finger on the pulse when it comes to sustainable aviation. Please welcome Carbon Direct Vice Chairwoman Nili Gilbert. You have your water here, which they delightfully label with names.
Very helpful.
Yes. So let's get right to it. We just saw Virgin Atlantic flight become the first to cross the Atlantic using 100% sustainable jet fuel. First, I want to get your reaction to that flight and how much progress it represents and what it shows us. And second, how promising is that success when it comes to the broader SAF market?
So I was so excited, needless to say, to see this flight. We've seen progress moving forward with sustainable aviation fuel implementation in regional flights, in blends, but to do a full SAF flight, transatlantic passenger jet is a substantial breakthrough, and I want to congratulate all of the partners who brought that forward. I'm sure it touched us all as we flew here to think about what's possible on the pathway forward. At Carbon Direct, just by way of context, we're a company that focuses on CO2 reductions and CO2 removals with science-based focused at its core. We have a team of about 80 scientists and experts, almost 40 PhDs, and one of the reasons that sustainable aviation and SAF is such a core focus for us is not only because it's such an important part of global decarbonization pathways, but because as this flight evidences, it's something that it feels like it's within our reach to solve this piece of the wedge. Aviation, as you know, is just over 2% of global emissions, but as you think about the easier to abate sectors, things that you can electrify, becoming proportionately lower share of emissions, and air travel continuing to rise, demand continuing to rise, including things like the rise of the middle class, people traveling for the first time, the share of aviation risks becoming a larger and larger proportion of global emissions if we don't do something about it, which we can.
And where do you see the most progress in the sustainability aviation market, particularly when it comes to scalability?
So we're seeing a lot of progress. A lot of the flights that we're seeing today are focused on pathways that use waste oil to produce sustainable aviation fuel, HEFA fuels. So think about used cooking oils, residual fats from meat, things like tallow. There we see most of the supply in the market today, and a lot of the flights that you're seeing are running on HEFA. Where we need to continue to see progress is in additional pathways for the production of sustainable fuel. There's only so much waste oil in the world and so much flying that we want to do. At Carbon Direct, we estimate that 6 to 8% of the total demand in the market can be met with this pathway. But we're excited to see technical readiness in other pathways coming forward. So we recently published a primer on sustainable aviation fuels that looked at multiple pathways, looked at their technical readiness, looked at the cost, and we identified a few other areas for focus to be able to bring this market to the scale that we need even by 2030. So as you know, you can produce sustainable aviation fuel from ethanol to jet pathways, high TRL. That's a strong focus of the market in the US. We also pointed to municipal solid waste as a feedstock. It's another waste feedstock, not used oil, but when you think about the life cycle upstream needs to produce it, since it's still waste, it's beneficial from a carbon intensity perspective. So this is using a Fischer-Tropsch production process. And we're also excited about air-to-jet. Combination of CO2, which can even be captured carbon dioxide, and nearly infinite source, very abundant feedstock, with green hydrogen. This is a costly process, but it's one that's coming along. And so when you think about what's needed, where we are, what we're excited about, it's really diversification of pathways to be able to meet future needs.
And what should we worry about in terms of the life cycle emissions of any of the fuels that are emerging right now? For example, with ethanol, that's something that we often report on with corn ethanol subsidies, that sort of thing. And with green hydrogen, there are concerns about where the energy is coming from in order to produce it. So are you concerned at all that, going down this road could end up oddly, increasing energy use in some sectors if we don't do this right?
Yes, so life cycle analysis is extremely important. Full life cycle analysis is extremely important when we're evaluating the carbon intensity and the benefits and choices across pathways. The most important thing to consider is the feedstocks. So when you think about especially food-based feedstocks, it's not just water, fertilizer, things like this that you need to take into account, but also land use, which competes with the food system for production. And so especially in places that don't have much land, limited in its ability to contribute at scale. You also pointed to energy. If you aren't able to produce on a clean grid, then the carbon intensity analysis is really thrown off. This is one reason that I think that it's important that when we think about pathways for aviation, that we also look across the entire economy at the implied demand for different inputs and think about where we can best apply different types of solutions. So when you think about sustainable aviation fuel, you'll hear people talk, for example, also about hydrogen as a fuel source for planes, but you're going to hear every hard-to-abate sector talk about hydrogen. how great if we can produce sustainable aviation fuel for now with limited supply of green hydrogen and apply it in other places. So this applies also to your question about renewable energy, really figuring out where to allocate the resources, when, and make sure that the whole picture adds up for our global decarbonization journey.
So backstage, we were talking about how this COP feels different compared to some of the seeds that were planted at COP26, which is what you mentioned. COP26 was in Glasgow. And I'm curious as to how much progress do you think is being made in the business world, kind of outside the Expo Center, and how much is being made in the policy sector as well, public-private partnerships or language that's going into some agreements?
Well, one thing that's interesting for this COP, COP28, is that the presidency put a strong focus all along in including non-state actors and the business world inside of the COP. And so we're not just around on the peripheries, we're really in the blue zone, in the meetings. We're not sitting in the negotiations. There actually are some CEO observers of the negotiations, although not negotiating. And this really, I think, for me, informs a picture of a broader evolution of what the global climate action journey looks like, and something that can continue to be a core focus. Obviously, we need an all-of-society response to be able to address this, and it's actually quite helpful if we can all sit around the table and look together at how we solve the problem. When you think about something as technical as sustainable aviation fuel, pathways, decarbonizing aviation, industrial decarbonization, it makes sense to me that the private sector, the companies that have the technical expertise and the ability to evaluate potential solutions should take the lead in making recommendations, testing, right, certain things. But certainly we can't get all the way to where we need to go without policy, partially because of the green premium, where SAF costs 2 to 5 times more than traditional jet fuel, which is holding back both demand and supply. But also we need policy coordination, where think about an international flight, or think about you're a buyer who's buying across multiple jurisdictions. So there we need not just strong policy, but stronger policy coordination, because with the uncertainty sitting in the market today, it is holding back buyers. It's holding back demand, which is holding back supply. So I think about this dance between public sector leadership, private sector leadership, and where each sector can push based upon its expertise, its reach, and how we get this all done, kind of a cycle, one passing to the other. I've been calling it the pull and pull, not the push and pull, but the push and push, or the pull and pull of private-public action moving together to get this done.
So you're somebody who focuses a lot and thinks a lot about decarbonizing hard-to-abate sectors,
Yes.
Particularly aviation. What do you like as a passenger to sit next to on a plane going, leaving Dubai, going back to the United States? I feel like if I worked on this topic and knew as much about this topic as you do, I'd be sitting there extremely frustrated that this flight was powered by 100% fossil fuels. I'm just curious what goes through your mind when you're doing this, when you see Virgin just doing this demo flight. There's been demo flights on United from Chicago to DC and elsewhere. I'm just curious as to as a person that might be sitting next to somebody who's asked, what do you do and what are you focused on? Is that a frustration or something that you're looking out the window at these giant engines and thinking, well, look at all the opportunity?
So first of all, you're gonna laugh. As a passenger, sometimes when I'm boarding my flight or I'm sitting on my flight, I will write to the sustainability team of the airline that I'm
Don't.
flying
Seriously?
to tell them that I'm thinking about their sustainable aviation journey. Lauren Riley is gonna come up after me from United. She'll tell you that it's true. I'll say, oh, I'm just sitting on your plane and I'm so excited about this and that or what's going on with this topic. So I also have learned enough about different airlines' approaches, different OEMs, that I think a lot about the plane that I'm sitting on. And I'm starting to vote with my feet. Some airlines are just doing more in this space, and I would rather fly with them. And so when I'm picking my flight options, I think about that as I choose my flight. We all love comfort in travel, but I think a lot about the weight of my plane lately, just based upon all of the wine and the water and the I love to fly. There are a lot of reasons that I'm passionate about sustainable aviation. I mentioned the number one reason that I'm passionate is because I think if we apply ourselves, we can get this done. But I love to see the world. I love learning about different cultures. You learned to fly before you learned to drive.
Yep.
Right? And so when I fly, I also come to this challenge with a personal passion for connecting the world and wanting to be a part of the solution for something that means so much to so many people.
Well, thank you. That's all the time we have, but I'm really glad we talked about that last question especially. And I hope you have a good rest of your COP experience.
Thank you. You too. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for coming. And thank you very much. Thank you. And our next and final guest here at Axios House Dubai, is an exciting one, somebody I've enjoyed talking with multiple times over the course of the last couple of years. Please welcome the Chief Sustainability Officer of United Airlines, Lauren Riley. Thanks for coming.
Well, hello.
As we just heard from Nili, one of the primary challenges of transitioning to SAFs is scalability, right? And you've talked about that with me as well. From your perspective at United, are we going fast enough? If not, can we catch up to the speed that we need to be expanding? What do you think are the realistic timelines that people should think about for scaling up SAFs?
Well, that's a really important question, and let me throw a pun out there first. I think I'm actually landing the plane tonight as the last speaker of the evening, so I appreciate everyone hanging in there this evening. But that's a really important question. We need to move faster. When I'm asked that question, what keeps you up at night, it is the pace in which we are seeing investment flow into aviation. But I'm optimistic that it's going to happen because what we're seeing is that aviation cannot decarbonize on its own. We are part of a much broader ecosystem around a clean energy transition. And for us to be successful in our journey to decarbonize, we are dependent on an abundant, cost-effective, renewable power sector. We need green hydrogen. We need a bunch of enabling technologies such that we in aviation can then benefit from those infrastructure shifts that need to happen so that we can then have the sustainable aviation fuels that we just heard about so that we can fly with lower carbon sustainable flights. And so I am optimistic. I think we're going to get there. I think the innovation we're seeing come to market now is just awesome. There's so many different pathways and so many new innovators that are stepping forward. And I'm really excited to see what we're talking about this time next year.
Here at COP, what are you hearing and what kinds of conversations are you having about sustainability in the aviation industry?
Well, COP is a really interesting forum for us because we actually sit not under the UNFCCC, but under ICAO, which is the International Civil Aviation Organization, sister group to the UNFCCC. However, we are a serious emitter. we are hard to abate, which means we don't have the solutions now, and we are part of that ecosystem I was talking about. So it's super relevant that we show up and we say, we have a plan, we have a commitment. Just a week or two ago, under the direction of ICAO, the global aviation industry stood together and declared that by 2030, we're going to reduce our emissions 5% from a carbon intensity point of view through the adoption of SAF and other low carbon fuels. That is a massive signal that we're serious and we want to shift the way we fly, but we can't do it independent of other sectors and the ability to rely on those that are going to innovate to get us there.
What do you think sets United apart from other airlines in the sustainable aviation space? And one specific thing that we've talked about in the past is when you book a ticket on United, it asks if you want to make a donation to the Sustainable Aviation Fund. I think that is what it is called. A lot of people that I've talked to at work sort of have ridiculed that as like, okay, like who's doing that, and is that enough? But we've actually talked about how surprising the results of that have been.
So what sets us apart is that United just simply kicks ass. I mean, thank you very much. We're the best airline out there.
I won't mention Newark Airport in this context.
We're talking about the airplanes, not the operation. But let's really talk about what United is trying to do, because this is the implementation COP, right? This is what actions are we taking to actually decarbonize aviation. The Sustainable Flight Fund is something that we stood up earlier this year, which is really an arm of our venture fund at United, focused on taking monies and investing in early stage startup technologies. We have about 13 investors in the fund itself. Boeing is one of them, thank you very much. But really, it's the group coming together across the value chain to say, we need to invest in those technologies that we as an operator, United uniquely, as the company that actually runs those planes and operates the airline, we understand it's going to work. We believe these technologies have the best capacity to actually get us to the finish line, and that's where we're putting our dollars. And I will note, actually, with the Sustainable Flight Fund, we have 3 other commercial airlines that have joined us in the fund, and essentially, my interpretation of that is, hey, United knows what they're doing, we want to come along for the ride. And I'll take that humbly as a nod to the talent of the team at United that's really leading the cause. But we've opened that up to our leisure travelers. And as you go through the booking path, you can actually select when you say, hey, I want to pre-purchase my snacks. I want to pick out my seat. I want to pay for my suitcase. I also want to contribute to the future of a sustainable flight by giving $1, maybe $3.50, up to $7. So it's not a very high amount that we're asking, but you can participate and contribute to the future of sustainable flight. United then takes those dollars, we invest them in these early stage startup companies, and together we're going to help facilitate the change that we see in the market. A lot of this is in reaction to the inaction that we're seeing. There are not a lot of dollars right now flowing to those companies that we really need their technology, and we need it not just to be proven out, but then to scale. And so this is really about a campaign to engage our corporate customers, our strategic partners, the value chain, but then also our leisure travelers. And it really has been remarkable, the adoption. So many of us know here today what a carbon credit is. Fine. We offered those for years. What was really interesting, and I was super skeptical of the Sustainable Flight Fund when we put it in the booking path because of the really poor performance we saw with the adoption of carbon credits. The Sustainable Flight Fund contributions, on average, have about 50 times more impact on a daily basis of contributions, so number of contributions, than we have ever seen. And I'm talking over like 5-7 years of carbon offset purchases, which means that our travelers are getting more sophisticated, and they want to be a part of the change, and they're pulling out their wallets to say, I'll give you $1. This is important to me. I want to see change happen, and I'm willing to participate. The last thing I will mention is that these customers are also clicking through to say, educate me about the emissions. What is sustainable aviation fuel? How do I get involved to help make sure that I feel good when I get on the airplane? I can check out, have a great ride, get to my destination, but know that the airline I'm choosing to fly, like we just heard from Neely, is the airline that I'm proud to fly on. And that's exactly what United is trying to chart.
And what about in Europe, where airlines appear to be outpacing airlines in the US when it comes to using SAF?
Where? In Newark? Is that what you said?
No. What about in Europe, where airlines
Europe.
appear to be outpacing some of the U.S. airlines?
So I think I have shadows of Newark in the back of my head. So carrots or sticks? That's where you're going, right? Carrots or sticks? We have heard numerous times at COP and before this sort of awe of the U.S. market, the market-based incentives, let the credits and the incentivization through the policies really drive the shift that we're going to see in the marketplace. It's pretty amazing. I think mandates probably have a role somewhere. I'm not quite sure which one's going to yield out as the winner in this game. But what I will say in the U.S. market, the amount of innovation that we're seeing come to market because of the incentives in the Inflation Reduction Act, which, by the way, historic policy, super awesome, credit to the administration. This was a big, big deal. Where we're seeing sort of a pause happen, though, is that we're getting some monies for early stage R&D. We're getting some monies for the 10 million gallon plant. That's great. Let's show demonstration, get some operational numbers out of it. What we're not seeing is a willingness to pay for that $1 billion plant that needs to follow. And for an airline like United that uses 4 billion gallons of fuel in any given year, we need 4 billion. I don't need the 10 million. I need the 4 billion. And so we need to get to that level of conversation. Capital needs to flow in that direction. And I'm optimistic the U.S. is going to get there. Europe probably will do too. I'm speculating it's going to be more expensive.
Yeah. Headed into 2024, where do you see United going in the sustainable aviation space?
Well, we're super bullish. We're going to continue to invest. We're going to continue to lead. We're going to continue to be very transparent with our customers. Being clear about the solutions that we need is super critical right now. We have a target on our back. We are heavy emitters. I get it. We also need patience, though. So for us to show progress year over year means that I've got to go out and buy some credits on the market without having to change a single business decision that I'm making as a leader in sustainability at United. That's not okay. That's not what we want to do. But it's also a little awkward to say, we hear you, it's urgent, the climate is really getting hotter and hotter, but we need you to just hang out. And like, hang on for a minute, because we're trying to build a marketplace over here. But truly we are. And so the progress indicator, the KPI that I encourage folks to see is not just the capacity for production, but the actual production itself. So that means moving from renewable diesel to SAF, getting net new technology pathways, moving from the 10 million gallons to the 1 billion, getting the capital in those places that can really help. We need to address the de-risking element of where the investment needs to flow. Those are the real indicators in the next 2 years, in my opinion. And then I think that it's off to the races and we're going to start seeing very fast scale of SAF.
So we're out of time. I have one question as a reporter who focuses a lot on the intersection between extreme weather and climate change. As an airline, are you worried at all about seeing increasing impacts on your operations from climate change related extremes? Specifically, I'm thinking extreme heat at certain airports, which require you to offload baggage, keep some passengers off potentially, or have planes melt into the ground, which I'm not saying is a unique problem to United, but I am saying has been happening at several airports in the United States in the past couple of years when they're trying to taxi out. So studies from the Department of Transportation have shown this to be a potential risk. Do you see this coming into the discussions in the C-suite at all?
Oh, absolutely, and what a dramatic close. I love it. So it's a very serious question, and we, for years, our industry is focused on safety. Number one is safety, and that will never change. But this conversation around what impacts safety, what drives safety concerns at a company, it's beginning to expand to include climate. And in fact, United last year did our first disclosure around climate risks. So physical locations, looking across our asset base, where do we have challenges from extreme weather, extreme cold, sea level rise, you name it. And we have resiliency plans already in place, largely in partnerships with the airports, to say, here's what we're going to do when these crises arise, because they will. And we are committed to making sure that we fly safely, we fly sustainably, and we are the airline that customers choose because we really do believe that the future has to be low carbon, and that is absolutely our commitment.
Well, thank you very much for coming and sharing this knowledge with us. Thank you to our sponsor, Boeing. Thank you to our audience for being with us today and over these past 3 days. That's it from us here at Axios, although please follow the rest of our COP28 coverage. I will be here until the end. Please stay after this, grab a drink with us one final time. We hope to see you again next year or at any of our Axios events in the meantime. Thank you and good night.